carry on our lesson with oil painting about laying out your palette. Keeping your colors organized will make the job of painting so much easier. As I explained earlier, I lay my palette out using this full chromatic palette, and here you can see I can paint pretty much any color that exists in nature with this palette. I can even reduce this number to 5 and still paint every color that you'll see in nature, with the exception of some of the very highly chromatic colors at the very spectrum, the edges of the spectrum of the color palette. But for a naturalistic palette, I can paint everything I need to with these colors. And we can talk about and look at this palette. Also, you'll notice it is laid out so that it's lightest to darkest. What are my darkest colors? Is black. What is my lightest color? White. You'll also see that I've laid my palette out along the color wheel from white to yellow to orange to red to blue to green and then to black. And by laying my palette out this way, I can keep track of where my paints are. So, as I said, talked a little bit about thinning, talked about the properties of paint. I'm just going to dip my palette knife into mineral spirits alone and just put the color here in just some mineral spirits. I'll grab a color, in this case just white. And you can see by thinning it what's happening. Just like you would if you're familiar with watercolor, I can thin that paint down very watery thin. And when that dries, it's going to crack. Now it's going to crack simply because maybe you've seen some old paintings in a museum that have those little tiny alligator cracks all over. Those are caused because they didn't use any medium or very little medium with their paint. What this does on the molecular level, on the very tiny minuscule level, is it separates the pigment particles with spirit. That spirit will evaporate and dry, leaving those particles farther apart. And the binder, in this case linseed oil, that was with the paint that keeps it all held together, has been thinned out also, which weakens the binder. So, cleaning your brush, thinning the paint is one thing, and it's perfectly acceptable at the very early stages of an oil painting. One of the rules we talked about, I mentioned in passing last time, is the rule of fat over lean. Meaning, the very first layers of paint can be very thin and very lean. But as you continue to build up to the paint, you'll use less and less and less thinner, and you'll have more binder or thicker qualities of paint towards the very end. When you glaze, or if you glaze at the end, and if you were to thin your oil paint with thinner, with no binder, we know that it would crack. But in order to do that, so you can still thin your paint and still glaze with a transparent, very thin membrane of color, you're going to want to add a lot of binder. So how would we want, if we wanted our paint to be very thin and still be durable, all we need is just a little bit, a touch of, in this case, our liquid. I'll just blend that with my paint. And now, when that dries, the alkyd binder in that paint or in that medium of liquid is going to hold those paint pigments together. It's like a glue. So that's the reason we use a medium. Just clean this off. Okay. When it comes to mixing paint on your palette, and say you want to mix a sky blue, and we use our ultramarine blue, and we use white, so we're going to use somewhere between here. Is it going to be more blue or is it going to be more white? Let's move it somewhere right about here, and we'll add a little bit of white to it. I'll add a little bit of binder It didn't take much. Just once it's in the paint, it's there. And if I want to go up in value, you can see, I'll just go higher in my palette, usually until I come up to the value. If I want to go deeper in value, take a little bit of my blue paint, just add that. And I can go lower in value. If I want to make a gray, take my white and my black. In this case, I'm going to make a perfect neutral gray. I want it right in the middle. And what's good about using this palette paper comes in gray or it comes in white. This particular gray palette color is right at a value 5, right in the middle of the value scale. A little bit of liquid. And I can use that gray palette color to judge, do I need to go lighter or darker in value? You can see that's a darker value than gray. So if I just come up with the white, I can get pretty close to that perfect gray 5 value. And I can use this to kill my blue color if I want to. So it's still blue, but now it's got gray with it too. So it's a very cool gray or a very gray blue. You can see that also. If I'm mixing a color that's going to be more towards the yellow, then I will probably want to keep my mixture over here. If I want to mix a yellow and a green, and I want it to be a very bright, sappy yellow green, you can see how that mixes so well together. I can also mix it, if I mix this green, this Viridian, with my red, in this case my Naphthol red, that imitates cadmium. They are neutralizing complementary colors. I can get a very beautiful, earthy, middle, almost brown color. Now what color is that really? It's hard to tell until you add white. But if I add a little white to that, look at that, turned into a beautiful violet. A very gray violet, but a beautiful purple violet. And that's because the phthalo has so much, not phthalo, excuse me, the Viridian has so much blue in it. Blue and red, as we know, make purple. You add a little bit more yellow to it, in this case to make it green, and you're going to get a neutralized violet. So by keeping your palette lined out with high chromatic colors or warmer colors on this side, cooler colors on this side, higher value colors up and lower value colors down, you can go back to remix that color, whatever color you're needing, almost perfectly. Remember, when you're thinning your paint, it's okay to use mineral spirits to thin, but just add a little bit of either liquid or a walnut oil. Now, why would I use one over the other? Well, for drying, for one. The liquid will really help speed the drying up enormously. It's an alkyd base, which is what acrylic paint's made of and that sort of thing too. So acrylic paint, if I paint with my oil paints and paint with my liquid, by the end of the day, the paint is going to be pretty tacky. And by tomorrow, overnight, it's pretty much dry to the touch. Unless there's a lot of thick paint, it'll still be dry to the touch. But if I want to extend the drying time and the workability of my paint, then I would tend to work with walnut oil. I can, and often do, mix both. Or I mix both of those together so I still get a nice fluidity of paint, and I can make a really beautiful buttery paint, but with the little addition of liquid or that alkyd painting medium will speed up the drying at the same time. So just give you a little bit of lesson on laying out your palette. And then the good thing about this, and I'll just show here also, is if we were finished with the palette, as if the palette were completely done and we're ready to start a new painting, you could see that I could just pull this up, rip it apart, and throw it into the trash. If you still have a dirty palette and you're wanting to clean your palette first, and you still have lots of pretty usable paint, just transfer the paint to the other new palette paper and you're ready to go. Otherwise, if it's the end of class, it's into your painting session, just put on your Masterson lid, clamp it down, make it nice and tight. And I have my paint ready to go. Now, if you're painting at home and you have a place that you can, and maybe you won't be able to paint for another 3 or 4 days, this paint will stay perfectly usable and workable for that long. To help extend that even more, put it in a nice, cool, dry area like a refrigerator. Set it in the flats back there and it'll work fine. Otherwise, just sit it in some place not in direct sunlight. That'll help speed up the drying. Don't leave it in your car, and that will help speed up the drying. You can keep it in your dark locker room for a few days if need be. You can then open up your palette again. And you are ready to start painting. If need be, use your palette knife to clean your work surface. And I would do this after every painting session, no matter what anyway. It'll just make it easier to come back to. One of the things I do at the end of a painting session, there's usually a lot more different kind of paint. I'll take all my paints and I mix them together. And it's just a little bit of hodgepodge of every color that I've used that day. And I mix it together and I save it over to the side. That becomes a great painting color. I can add it to other colors to neutralize. See, it becomes a gray. It's called a torrent gray. There's not a real color. Torrent gray just means it's a chaos gray, but everything tends to move towards the middle. And you can see how that's a perfect color to add to any other colors to bring things down with. And so I like to save whatever colors that I painted with that day on my palette, blend them together. It gives me a reason to clean the palette. It gives me a reason to use that color. Then I can just dip my painting towel into my palette. I can clean my surface up. And I'm ready to paint again. So, one other suggestion. Keep lots of paper towels around. Also, t-shirts make great painting cloths. Old clothes that you're throwing away, cotton especially, old socks, anything that you can use as a painting rag will come in handy. I promise it'll get used in oil painting. Better that than your clothes.